thank you so much for all the questions that you've submitted. We can't ask all of them, unfortunately, but I'll ask some anyway. So, thank you very much. To start off with a very difficult question, Ard. What is your Erdos bacon number?
Okay,
well, we might need to explain what that is.
I think it's 5'2".
Okay.
So I forget. So the Erdos number is, Paul Erdos is a great mathematician who wrote about 1,000 papers, collaborated with lots of people. If you collaborate with Paul Erdos, you have an Erdos number of 1. If you collaborate with somebody who collaborated with Paul Erdos, you've got an Erdos number of 2, etc. The Bacon number is, if you've been in a film with Kevin Bacon, you have a Bacon number of 1. If you've been in a film with somebody who's been in a film with Kevin Bacon, then you have a Bacon number of 2. So my Bacon number is 2 because I was with Morgan Freeman. And my Erdos number, I think, is 4 or 5. I forget what it is, 4 or 5, because I worked with people who worked with Paul Erdos. This is a classic geek thing.
Okay, anyway, sorry, that was just to satisfy the geek in some of us. But anyway, the serious questions this time. If a question is unanswerable scientifically, then why study it?
Well, there are lots of questions that are unanswerable in the sense of scientifically unanswerable, but they're perfectly interesting questions. And so if I ask, does my wife love me? Okay, then the question would be, should I look at that scientifically? Now, if I took a kind of scientific approach to this and said to my wife, well, in science, we don't believe things until we have enough evidence for them, so I'm going to assume that you don't love me until you show me enough evidence that you do. There's a lot of evidence that I would never see, okay, because obviously that's not a healthy way of having a relationship. And in fact, if I think of another example of a question that's really important, it's very closely linked. If I want to decide, if I want to ask myself, should I marry a particular person? So in my case, my wife. It's not like I did a bunch of repeatable experiments in marriage and so I was happy with it. That's not a good idea either. In fact, it's not even that. We did, in fact, these compatibility tests that you do, where you measure, where you count, all kinds of questions, what kind of food you like, what kind of movies you like, where do you squeeze the toothpaste. But you don't marry somebody because you both score 97% on it. And the reason that you don't do that is because you don't know what it's like to be married until you're married. There's a commitment that has to come first before the evidence comes. And so it's a decision you have to make that you cannot explain scientifically. Now, science can help you, maybe, with some adjudication, but it's not the right way of thinking about it. It's just a category error. And so that's an example of a kind of question that many people in this room have made or will have made: should I marry person X or person Y? And using science, you won't have a definitive answer to the question. And if you want to have definitive answers, you'll be waiting around forever. You need to commit at some point. And that's because that's the way the world is. In fact, I would say religious knowledge has that characteristic to it. So there's religious evidence that is not available to us until we've committed to God. This would be a traditional Christian way of thinking about our relationship with God. There's things we don't see until we've committed to God. That doesn't mean that you should just walk out on the street and grab the first best person you see and marry them. Say marry me. If I went on the street and said that to a woman, that would be very scary. If she said yes, that would be even scarier. If you have small children, you watch Frozen, right? Hans, and he's the baddie in the end, but they decide to get married on the same day. It's not good. It's because we do have ways of adjudicating these questions, like you get to know the other person, you see whether you would like to be around the person, that's pretty important. You see whether your friends or people you trust think highly of this person. If your friends tell you that person's toxic, then that's something you should listen to and care about. You do the compatibility test I mentioned. There's lots of other things you might do. There's lots of ways that communities have worked out ways of helping people make that decision, but it's fundamentally not a scientific decision. And it's and I can think of lots of examples in life that have that nature to them. We make decisions, we answer questions all the time, but science may help us somewhat, but it's just the wrong category.
Thank you very much. That's a very clear answer. Next question is, do you think morals are consciously learned or the result of genetically inherited instinct? Or do you think they originate from a higher being?
That's a very good question. So when we talk about morality, we have to be careful and unpick different ways of thinking about moral talk. So we all have certain instincts or predilections, or we might have an instinct towards violence or not have violence. In fact, that may be genetic, it could be social. So if you've been badly treated, badly hurt as a child by your parents, you're statistically more likely to be violent towards your own children. That's because that's a tendency that you have. Right? That's one example of something bad. If you've been well treated, something good might happen. Then that's a question of, and our genetics unquestionably gives us certain predilections versus others. We have certain things we tend to want to do. Males are much more likely to want to be sexually unfaithful than females. That's genetically probably true. That doesn't tell you whether it's right or not. Right? There's another question, which is a kind of a moral question about, is it right to behave this way or not that way, which is different from the question about whether I've got certain moral tendencies or not. And then there's a level above that, which you might call something meta. So those are ethical questions. There's a kind of meta-ethical question, which is, where do those ethics come from? And in that question, all three were interlinked, where they were asked, do I think that genetics has moral component? And the answer is yes, just like our socialization has moral components. Nothing new or strange about that. Are certain things right or wrong? I believe that they are. So there's a big distinction between moral realists who believe that things are right or wrong, or things are only socially constructed. But unquestionably, our moral kind of behavior and our moral environment is socially constructed. Just watch the difference between two different cultures, or even between probably Hull and a few cities down, how people behave, what they consider to be right or wrong. Netherlands, where I'm coming from, is a country well known for its directness. And so my wife and I, after we got married, a few months later, we saw my parents again. The first thing my mother said to me is, "Oh, you have gained weight," which in many other cultures we consider very rude, but in the Netherlands, that's just saying the right thing. So that's something socially constructive. I'm not saying whether that was the right thing or wrong thing to say, but I'm used to that with my Dutch mother. And so there's aspects of our moral behavior which are social, but that doesn't mean they're nothing but social. Right? There's lots of things that we think are true. I believe it's morally wrong to torture children for pleasure. I'm pretty sure that's universal in this room. And I believe that's wrong whether you believe it or not. If you tell me you don't believe it, I'm right, I'll say you are wrong. Right? And I can think of many other, that's one extreme example I use. So I think moral realism is true. Then there's a meta question, which is, where do these morals come from? Right? Why are they there? Right? And that's another, Christians would traditionally say they come because they're linked to the character of God. And actually, there's lots of interesting arguments about exactly how that works. But the idea is very strong that if there is a God behind this world, then we expect there to be moral truths. I'll riff on this in a different direction. So in our film, Why Are We Here? We have a whole section on morality and lots of interesting things. We share a lot of moral behaviors with animals, for example. That's not at all surprising, or it's actually quite interesting. But doesn't tell us whether these moral behaviors are right or wrong, or not true, or true or not true. But the idea that there may be moral truths that are true, whether we believe it or not, and are non-scientific things, but nevertheless true, is not that much stranger than the idea that there are mathematical truths that are true, regardless of whether we can adjudicate them scientifically or not. So any mathematician or anybody who does mathematics, at some point you'll start getting into mathematics, which is very far removed from the natural world. You can start with something like the imaginary numbers, which when they were first came up with were assumed to be non-physical. We now use them everywhere in quantum mechanics. Okay? It's a common experience that we have these things that we discover. But the experience of discovering mathematical truth is almost universal among people that work on these kinds of things. So these mathematical truths were true. So I squared was equal to -1 long before any of us existed, and it's true whether you know about it or not. And it's a truth. The question then is, what's the physical instantiation of that truth? Is that truth hiding somewhere behind the moon? No, it's not. It's a non-material reality, which is true. In the same way, it's not at all surprising to me that there would be moral truths that are true and that are non-material truths, just like the laws of mathematics are non-material truths. Nothing surprising with them. I don't need to be a Platonist to believe in this. I don't have to believe there's some kind of factual form. They're just things that are true, but they happen not to be empirically, at least their verification doesn't depend on empirical realities. I can prove a mathematical formula is true or not using the laws of logic. I don't need to do an experiment so that they're true. Now, in the question of morality, it's much harder. It's much harder to adjudicate. But that doesn't mean that we throw up in the towel and say that therefore there is no answer. I think there are things that are true and things that are not true in the moral realm. It's clearly a much more clouded and complicated field, simply because we see that cultures vary. Right? And so we should be that means that we should be careful about, we should also be careful about thinking that our own culture is somehow better than another culture because we happen to have brought up that way. It doesn't mean that we're right. We might need to learn from other cultures about moral truth.
Okay, thank you. At this point, I wonder, I'd like to sort of throw questions for live questions, so our sort of mic runners in place. I'd like to, first of all, maybe say, is there anyone from the university, either staff or student, so just give different sections sort of an opportunity. Anybody from the university would like to ask a question? Okay, I see.
What are your views on life after death?
So what do I believe about life after death? So I believe classic Christian tradition that there is a continuity between now and afterlife, and that there is something will be in relationship with God. Perfectly classic Christian beliefs. Sorry. So I believe, can you hear me better now? I believe in some kind of continuity between this life and the next. That in the Bible, it speaks about we'll be in new creations, in contact with God in a new creation. Pretty much uncontroversial in Christian circles, controversial outside, obviously.
Did you want to elaborate on that? No, sorry.
So consciousness being in our brain,
Yeah.
neurons and electrons, that's obviously the physical thing.
Yeah.
So when we pass that physical
Yeah.
consciousness of who we are, that physically is gone.
Yeah.
How do you scientifically explain it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I understand the question.
What's the evidence sort of?
I think that's an excellent question. So the question was, I'll repeat it for the camera. So the question was, if consciousness is embedded in the substrate of our brain in the neurons and electric impulses, and that stops when we die, how does that work? You know, what happens to us in the future? Well, that's a perfectly legitimate, interesting question. So if you believe, as I believe, that God not only created the world but sustains the world, then God is somehow much greater than nature. Right? And therefore, what Christians believe is it's not very hard for God to make a continuity between what is our physical instantiation and something else in the future. You can just simply recreate it. And the minute you posit something like a God who created this world with his unbelievable complexity and his elegance, that's a small step. Right? If you don't believe there's a God, and you want to say, I'm going to look at the laws of nature, then you have a problem with that step. But that's a problem with your assumptions, not a problem with your logic. Yeah, and unquestionably, when we talk about life after death, we're talking about something outside of the laws of nature as we know it. And I've actually, if you Google my Ard Louis miracles, I've written an essay on this, going into this in more detail. And I don't actually speak about consciousness particularly, but I talk about the meta question that you're asking, which is really, how can a scientist believe that there are things that like miracles, right? So if I die and I am then taken into a new creation, into heaven in some way or the other, that would be miraculous in the sense of not being the way that we're used to thinking about the laws of nature working. And at first instance, that seems very strange. How could a scientist possibly believe that? And my argument I make in my article, which is a fairly simple one, is to say, if you believe there's a God who created the world, who sustains the world, it would be very surprising if that God could not sometimes sustain the world in a different way, okay, if he so wanted to, or change things in other ways, right? That would be a small step compared to the complexity of making the world. So it's not a difficult logical leap once you've made that assumption. That's I quoted John Polkinghorne's 2 ways of looking at the world to try to make that clear, that if I take the point of view that there is a God, I make that assumption, and then look at the world, then a lot of these things that seem strange are not that strange. If I assume there's no God, then obviously anything that has God linked in it will seem strange, but that's because that's not a conclusion that comes from there, it's an assumption.
Thank you very much. I know that the number of secondary school, sixth form college students, which is fantastic. I wonder whether there's anybody, a question from someone from a secondary school or sixth form college, actually staff or students are both fine. I know it's a lot of people here to ask the question, but any questions? Sorry if I put you on the spot. Okay, great. Yep, go for it.
You said that you believe in evolution. How does that link in terms of the Bible from Genesis when it talks about the creation of Adam and Eve?
Great, thank you. So the question is, I believe in evolution. So first I should say evolution is a very complicated word. It means many things. It can mean the complexity of life changed over time from early life on our Earth was something unicellular, prokaryotic, very simple cells. Now we've got something, all kinds of animals around, much more complicated, so there's a change. The second question would be, how did that change happen? And then we would talk about natural selection and variation as being one of the best ways of explaining how that change may have happened, although there may be lots of questions we're still left with how that worked. And then there's evolution as a big picture, kind of evolutionism, the idea that evolution is a worldview that tells us who we are. So classic example would be Richard Dawkins saying, evolution allows us to be self-fulfilled atheists, or George Gaylord Simpson saying, basically saying that we are the product of man is a product of an evolutionary process that did not have him in mind, right? These are meta questions that I don't think the science does at all. So when we talk about evolution, it's really important that we decouple those and that we don't import these evolutionism into our story. And then what you're really talking about is, if a Christian believes that God created the world, the question would be, how did God create the world? So I gave you my example of self-assembling Lego blocks. So one way could be God made the world all as it is now, or almost as it is now, 6,000 years ago, which would be like me making fully formed Lego trains for my children. The other way would be, say, God created a process by which these things happened, which would be giving my children boxes of Lego and they shake it, and out comes a train. Now that train may have a few scratches on it from that process, but I think, my children at least, I think the second one is a lot cooler than the first. So that's a kind of natural theological, I look at the science and ask myself, what does it mean? The second question I think you're asking is probably linked to, how do I interpret the Bible? What is Genesis saying to me? And then I think it's really important that when we read the Bible, that we take it as a piece of, look at what is it actually saying? What's the genre? What kind of literature is there? And so when you read the Genesis text, you find something really interesting and quite surprising at first sight. So the Genesis text starts with the days. There's a first day, there's morning and evening of the first day, morning and evening the second day, morning and evening the third day, and it goes on. So the first day, there was light and darkness were made on the first day. The sun and moon are not created until the fourth day. Now, you don't have to be a modern scientist to realize that the sun and the moon are needed for morning and evening, okay? So what was the author trying to do? Well, you can look further in the text. The words are not sun and moon. The words are greater lamp and lesser lamp. Same word for lights in your tent. So why? We think, okay, fine. Yeah, if you want to use that word, you can. But imagine the context. In that day, the intelligentsia, the scientists of the world, were astrologers. They believed that the sun and the moon and the stars were living creatures, beings that controlled our lives. So what this author is saying is, I'm demoting these things to the fourth day. They're not that important. They don't even need them for morning and evening. Not only that, they're not beings up in the sky. They're physical objects, okay? It's actually fairly recent that our telescopes are strong enough to adjudicate once and for all that is true. Okay, that was a scientific claim that was made by the author. And this tells us something. This tells us that this text was not meant to be read as a kind of journalistic narrative, and very different from other parts of the Bible. So if you take the Gospel of Luke, Luke was a doctor who wrote about the life of Jesus, he starts by saying, I wrote these things down in an orderly way to his friend Theophilus. He's writing something that would be more akin to the way someone would write history today. It's not quite modern history in its writing style, but it's clearly reportage. He's writing down what he thinks journalistically happened. Those were completely different texts. And the minute you realize that, then there's quite a bit of freedom in understanding Genesis. In fact, Genesis becomes much richer. I just gave you one example of what it's telling you. It's telling you that we shouldn't be astrologers, okay? But that was crazy. For the people at the time, that would be as crazy as if I went here to the whole Department of Physical Astronomy and told them in a science lecture that the sun and moon were controlling our lives. They would probably be kicking me out very quickly. Right? And so that was a strange and weird thing to say, but it's very powerful. And so if you start understanding that and looking at Genesis, in that first chapters, you'll see all kinds of really important things. The fact that God created human beings. It doesn't say the mechanism by which he created them, but he created them, that they're loved by God, that humans have a mandate to care for creation. All kinds of things are in there that are incredibly important. And when we try to look at it as if it's a piece of journalism, we're actually missing out on something very profound.
Thank you. Just one more last question. Okay, I think this gentleman has been waiting patiently, so.
May it not be that the case that questions that science cannot answer are unanswerable? It follows that your religious answers are illusory or fallacious.
So I think I tried to say that maybe one of the most important points I hope to make today is the following one, which is that there are lots of questions that science can't answer, and the idea that therefore they are not important questions is actually a dangerous thought. What happens in practice is, because there are lots of questions that science can answer, if you say you can only be answered by questions, what really happens is people who are scientists wrap themselves in the mantle of science and pronounce on them anyway. The idea that any question that can't be scientifically answered is therefore a non-question was formalized in what's called logical positivism in the 30s, 40s, 50s. It's a philosophical trend which just died out largely because it was sterile. It's come back a little bit in the New Atheists. There's a kind of logical positivism underlying it, but no serious philosopher would take that as being anything other than silly. So it's unquestionably true that there are many really important questions in life, like what does it mean to be human? What's the value of a human being? How do I live my life? Is there a God or is there not a God? What does it mean to be moral? That science cannot answer, but that doesn't make those questions any less important. It just tells us that we've got to think about them in a different way. And in fact, that's why it's important for our universities not to become just science, technology training factories, because we need other people to teach us. That's why it's really important that disciplines like theology are embedded into our universities, because they help us think about these big questions. We may not agree with everything that other people say, but we have to learn how to interact with them. We have to learn how to think about them. And we have to think carefully and deeply about them.
Did you want to push back on that, or? No? Okay, great. Let me... There seems to be a growing appetite for questions now from the audience. That gentleman there. Oh, poor Sophie's a bit bored, but all the questions seem to be coming here. Great.
Hello. With constant conflict going on within your field, the subject can be quite subjective. That being said, do you feel theoretical physicists deviate too much away from actual science?
Yeah, thank you.
You're questioning the whole basis of his career.
I think. Give me an example. Could you give me an example of where you think we might be deviating from science?
So maybe, for example, theory of relativity and quantum mechanics, they don't go well together. Okay, I understand. For example.
Good, excellent. So the question is, this is actually a very topical question at the moment, and a very good one. So in physics, we have forces. So we have the electroweak force, the strong force, which is a nuclear force, the weak force is a nuclear force, and then we have gravity. Okay. So there's a standard model which connects the first three and explains them extremely well, which the last particle was found in CERN not too long ago, the Higgs boson, for which Peter Higgs, who was from Edinburgh, got the Nobel Prize for. But then there's gravity, which we don't know how to connect up together. And so the dominant theory at the moment among my colleagues for how this would work is called string theory, which is a mathematical construction, very beautiful mathematical construction. It unfortunately lives in 10 or 11 dimensions, and we're used to having 4 dimensions. And so you've got to wrap up 6 or 7 of those. We have 4 dimensions, 3 space and 1 time. And so there's the discussion, which has been very prominent in the field, is we've been doing this for 30 years. We've not made a empirical prediction yet that could be tested. So is this real science, or has it turned into something else? I think that's the question that you're asking. And the answer to that is, I think we need to take a good look at this subset of physics and ask ourselves whether we might need to use different ways of adjudicating it. It's more like philosophy than science at the moment. On the other hand, it's still, you may think 30 years is a long time, but it's not a long time for something as complicated as string theory. We don't understand it well enough yet to make this kind of predictions. So my friends who are string theorists will say, you wait, we'll get something to you soon. But the rest of physics, no. So for us, it's extremely important that experiments test our theories. There's a saying among my colleagues and I, there are many beautiful theories that were ruined by an ugly experiment, by which we mean the experiment shows the beautiful theory to be wrong. Okay? And so it's incredibly important in science that we have experimental verification, because we often can go down rabbit warrens where we're sure we're right and it ends up not being true.
Okay, I think, let me just say, sadly, we've almost run out of time. But before we finish, I thought it would be nice if you had any final thoughts that you wanted to leave with us as a sort of take-home message, and then I'll wrap up. So, sorry to just put you on the spot there.
Well, yeah, no. Well, thank you very much for coming. One final thought would be that it's really important to wrestle with these big questions. The fact that you're here means you're a very self-selected audience. I think in the world around us, a lot of people just live their lives. They go to the shopping mall, they go on holiday, and they just hope not to think about these things. Clearly, you're different because you wouldn't be here otherwise. I think it's super important. And so we need to think about these big questions and not just assume that you can just live life without thinking about them. For me, the story of Jesus Christ was absolutely transformative in my own life. It completely changed how I think about things. And so I think you have to think about that very carefully as well. Perhaps read one of the Gospels fresh, as if you've never seen it before, and ask yourself, what does this really mean? Is this the kind of language you might get from God who came to earth? But I realize for some of you that may not be that interesting. For me, that was really something very helpful. And so those are probably my last words I leave with you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ard, for doing such a tremendous job. It's a huge topic, I realize. In such a short time, it's impossible to completely cover everything, obviously, but you've done a tremendous job. So let's show our appreciation to our speaker. So, brilliant.